And you already got CV and all those topic of today's book talk. But if I may briefly introduce her. Dr. Solis is the director of the Center of East Asia Policy Studies at Brookings, and also she's a Philip Knight Chair in Japan Studies and Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Division program at the Brookings Institution. You all know Brookings is the biggest and #1 think tank in the US. That means, by definition, the best think tank in the world. And she's in charge of East Asia program over there within the foreign policy programs. And originally, she taught at the University of American University. She used to be the tenured full-time professor at American. And then she moved to Brookings, you told me, about maybe 10 years ago. And now she's working for this think tank and policy area. But as a very solid, prominent and solid scholar, she continues to engage in this research, which is the top outcome of today's book. And she has been the most one of the prominent experts on Japanese economy, but not only Japan, but at the same time the greater East Asian economy and the trade relation, especially. So she was very much engaged in the East Asia, US and East Asia, and especially in terms of the trade partnership, TPP, IPEF, before WTO, etc., and all the FTAs and as well, and bilateral, and of course the North American NAFTA, and today's they always change the name, so it's very difficult to catch up with all those changes. But anyway, now recently she has been working on, as we all know. Usually I don't talk too much, but I'm talking a little longer for you to have a time to eat here. So please feel free to do whatever you. This is a very casual setup, and the point is we are having this lunch seminar. So I hope you also enjoy this salad today, along with Mireya's excellent talk. But anyway, so she's been quite, if I know, since I keep meeting her, visiting Brookings every year, and she's been very critical of U.S. trade policy. As a big proponent of all this, free trade and globalization and institutionalization of all this trade networking, which is good for everybody. It's not. We used to, learn that it's a win-win situation for everyone. But unfortunately, recently, with this geopolitical rivalry between U.S. and China, and there has been a trade war, and there has been some kind of protectionist tendency, not only, by the way, United States and in many other places in Europe, etc. So we've been exchanging our view on where this world is headed at the moment, and she's been one of the prominent critique and analyst of all those situations. But then this book, I think she is getting into maybe more of original, research area, which is Japanese economy, which in and itself is a very going through interesting maybe these days transition or transformation. So that's the topic of her talks. At the same time, in that context, she may also talk about economic security issues, which is everybody is talking about, including President Biden always. And I guess even today's the APEC meeting, which is going on in San Francisco, the attention is what these two leaders finally, Biden and Mr. Xi will talk about, and what will be the outcome, the implication for the world and for the region, but also, I guess, implication even for U.S. election next year, who knows. Anyway, so my point here is we are at a very interesting time, if I may say, but at the same time very volatile. Everything is changing and up in the air. But in that context situation, I'm so happy to have Dr. Solís to talk about all this. I just raised lots of questions, and I'm sure she will has all the great answers to all those difficult issues. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. Solís, and she will give us maybe 30 to 40 minutes of presentation about her books, along with all these important issues, and then maybe follow up the open up the Q&A. Okay, so please welcome Dr. Solís with the.
Is this on?
Yeah.
On? Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at Seoul National University. I want to thank my friend, Professor Seong-ho Sheen, for hosting this talk. It's wonderful to have Dean Kim and to have a front row of dear friends, and also to be able to interact with all of you. Really looking forward to your questions, to your comments. You spend so many years writing a book in front of your desk, and finally to come out and talk about the ideas and then get opinions, feedback, questions. It's a very rewarding experience. So I would like to just offer some comments about what is the main argument, in particular why I wrote the book, and what is the essence of the argument. I would like to also tease out some implications for Japan, South Korea, US relations. I think that's a very interesting time in terms of trilateral relations, and I thought that may also be of interest given that I'm here at SNU. So the title is Quiet Leadership, and how Japan is quietly reshaping the Indo-Pacific. And before I tell you about the argument, I should perhaps say a word about the adjective I chose, and that is quiet, because I get a lot of questions about that. And I think that there are two main ideas behind why I chose this title. One is that I think that Japan has many problems, and I'm going to discuss them in some depth today, but also has some assets or strengths that are not readily visible, and they go under the radar. So Japan has greater social and political stability today than, say, the United States. But that doesn't create headlines. And I think that's one of the things that I want to capture in the book, that a lot is happening inside Japan that we may not be aware of. And quiet, too, because of the way in which Japan seeks to play out or implement its foreign policy. And one of the ideas of the book is that I think that Japan is doing more with limited resources, with a very proactive diplomatic push. And again, frequently these are diplomatic initiatives that do not get enough attention, but that they make a difference in the way in which the regional architecture, both in economics and security, is evolving. So Dean Kim had asked me about why quiet, so let me start with that element there. So why I wrote the book? The book is really a deep dive over the last 30 years, trying to trace what has happened inside Japan and trying to understand why Japan is playing a very different role internationally and certainly in the region. This period, the last 30 years, are frequently associated with the so-called lost decades. And the idea is that Japan has gone through a very difficult period. You probably remember that Japan was considered to be like an unstoppable economic machine for a very long time. But then in the 1990s, Japan stumbled, and it stumbled badly. And the leadership could not find a decisive solution to its problems, and the country was not adapting well to the post-Cold War era. And so the lost decade label was born, and it has stuck. And my concern is that certainly there is, of course, elements of truth in using that term, and that's why it has stayed for so long. But my concern is that we've been overusing it. And therefore, because we feel that nothing has happened in Japan in these 30 years, nothing interesting has happened, that does not create an interest or an incentive for scholars, for analysts, for students to look at what's been going on in Japan. And the story that the book wants to tell is that a lot has been happening in Japan. I think this has been a period of profound changes in almost every area that you can think of in the country. So when you think about politics, for example, new electoral rules, a new electoral system that basically changed the way in which the voter thinks about the political process, changed the way in which parties try to compete with one another. There are also very important changes to policy dynamics, policy-making dynamics in Japan, and we begin to see more centralization of power in the figure of the prime minister, where Japan in the past had very weak prime ministers. But also changes in the economy, some good, some bad. But certainly the way in which the Japanese businesses are organized, that has changed quite a bit. Japanese business groups used to gravitate around a main bank. That is gone. And also changes in which the country articulates its foreign policy on economic and security terms. And I'll have more to say on that. But, you know, as I was writing the book, and I began to realize that this is actually a period of change. But nevertheless, tremendous problems that the country has not yet solved. I came to the conclusion that trying to make sense of these, both change and continuity, or some mistakes and progress that I was witnessing, that there are two important dynamics that I wanted to highlight in the book. And I think of those as the core messages of the book. One is that, you know, 30 years down the road, I think that Japan has become more relevant to many more countries than not. Because when Japan stumbled, and Japan was not doing well for so long, many analysts felt that we would witness what was referred to as Japan passing. And that is that structural decline meant that Japan would just fade in obscurity. But I find that Japan's experiences have become more important to many advanced industrialized nations who are now experiencing problems that Japan experienced first. And there are lessons on what to do or what not to do looking at Japan's experience. So what are these areas where Japan was perhaps the front runner in experiencing the challenges? Well, of course, demographic decline, that's the one that everybody always has in mind. And for a long time, it seemed to be that people referred to these aging and contracting of the population that Japan is experiencing, and it's a huge challenge. But for a long time, it was seen as a Japan challenge alone, that there was something wrong about Japan in particular that set it aside. And in fact, we find, you now look at the UN reports on population trends, and Japan is just at the beginning, or it has experienced this first, but there are many other countries that are now experiencing the same demographic trends. And South Korea also faces this challenge, but many other industrialized nations, but also nations that are still trying to promote development, such as China. China is going to suffer a huge demographic cliff in the next few decades. The other one that I think Japan has a lot of, the Japanese experience is very interesting, and I'm surprised it has not really captured more discussion, generated more discussion, is Japan's management of economic globalization. And, you know, Japan, as I'll elaborate further, has indeed experienced trade and investment globalization. Words that in the United States are toxic these days, they generate a lot of pushback. And in Japan, you don't see that backlash against globalization for reasons that I'll try to explore later. So there's some things there that perhaps could be useful to learn about how Japan has managed economic globalization. And the other one that I think also is very relevant for South Korea and many other countries in this part of the world is, of course, what is it like to be a frontline state in this growing geopolitical tension with the rise of China. And again, Japan experienced a lot of this more assertive Chinese behavior early on. In 2010, for example, China imposed an embargo on important materials because of this conflict tension in the East China Sea. So again, this is just to highlight that there's things to pay attention to in terms of how Japan is relevant. But the second message, and I do see these hopefully as the anchor to the book, to generate hopefully attention and the desire to read the book, is that I find that there is an interesting puzzle here. Because it's undisputable that Japan has suffered a loss of relative capabilities, right? Because of the demographic trends, because of the period of slow growth, many of those years with deflation, and also because many countries around Japan have actually embarked in military buildup and have become much more assertive in how they act in the region. China, North Korea, and so forth. So clearly there's been a loss of relative capability. So to me the interesting question is, how could Japan become more consequential to what is happening in the region, have more influence in the evolving regional architecture despite this loss of relative capabilities? That I think is what I think is at the heart of the book's argument. And I'll elaborate on this, but the argument I make is that Japan has been able to do more with less by resorting to what I refer to as a network strategy or a connectivity strategy. And that is what I have in mind when I say it's been fundamentally a diplomatic push from Japan on economic and security affairs. So let me then try to get at the factors in a little more detail of how can we explain that we have a more proactive Japan today, even though it's no longer that unstoppable economic machine of years past. And the way the book is organized, and this was for me really the learning opportunity, is that I realized that I couldn't explain Japan's international role without doing a deep dive into what was happening at home, domestically, and to venture into new topics for me, like political competition, immigration, the social mechanisms to adjust to economic globalization. And when I was looking at all these different factors and trying to organize my thoughts, I came to the conclusion that there are at least two fundamental changes inside Japan, and then I'll talk about how the neighborhood has changed. But the first dimension that I think it's really interesting to discuss is that many industrialized countries, advanced liberal democracies in the West, are going through a lot of turmoil. There's a lot of social and political polarization. This, in many ways, they're of populism. And the United States is experiencing this with particular intensity. What I find interesting is that Japan has not experienced this populist wave. You don't see this backlash against globalization. You don't see this challenging of electoral integrity. You don't see these political divides. And what's interesting to me is not that Japan has been insulated and did not experience the same forces that are fueling these policies, this politics of grievance. But I think that these pressures have been managed differently. Not always successfully, but certainly differently. And what I have in mind is, again, as I was mentioning earlier, Japan has indeed experienced intensely the forces of economic globalization. And what I have in mind is the offshoring of a significant share of the industrial base. Japanese companies were front runners in the development of global supply chains. And in some industries, the foreign production ratio is actually quite elevated. In the United States, offshoring is incredibly contested notion, because the idea is that you're exporting jobs. But Japanese companies have gone overseas. They were motivated first by the appreciation of the yen, but also they're responding to demographic trends and the need to service markets abroad. And we also find that income inequality has increased in Japan as well. And this is certainly not a positive development, but it does mean that these stressors are present. Now, the book tries to get us to why in Japan you don't see these deep polarization, and there are many complex factors at work. But one is, first of all, that Japan has an economic relation with China that is different than the one the United States has built, because it's based more on supply chain trade, which means flows back and forth of components, of equipment, and the labor outcomes of that trade relationship tend to be more benign than what we've experienced in the United States. Secondly, because in the United States, we don't have a good safety net, we don't have social domestic policies that help people adjust to economic change, not just because of trade, but also because of technological change. And Japan is better equipped there in some fronts, certainly with universal health care and stronger labor protections. So I find that it's very interesting that Japan, which used to be so passive on trade, has now emerged as a really champion of trade liberalization. And this is something that really made a difference in the influence and the power projection in the I would also like to point out that even though Japan's democracy is not consumed by populism, that does not mean that the country does not face significant challenges in terms of the vitality or dynamism of democracy. And the book also has a chapter comparing the American and the Japanese democracy. And what I find is that in the case of Japan, it seems that many of its problems are the mirror opposite of what I see in the United States, in the sense that, from my point of view, the problem that Japan faces is one of disengagement and apathy from the political process, because there's not a lot of alternatives, and you have one dominant party or ruling coalition, and that creates little incentive for the public to be more engaged in politics, and that's a problem for Japan going forward. So that's an important, I think, change in Japan, that Japan has some institutions and policies that prepared it better to deal with economic globalization and also avoid the populist wave. But the other thing that I believe changed in Japan, and this was a product of political and administrative reforms over a long time, that is that for the first time we saw the possibility in the last decade of having a strong prime ministers who could actually overrule powerful veto interests. In Japan, for a long time, it was not possible to do much on trade because of the power of the agricultural lobby. And that changed, and Japan was able to seek a membership into the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement. And for the first time, we see Japan creating whole-of-government decision-making structures. You have the establishment in 2013 of a National Security Council. You have the establishment of a TPP headquarters, so that you bring elite bureaucrats to a headquarters to negotiate on trade with a level of ambition that had never been possible before, because Japanese bureaucracies were frequently fighting one another in front of their counterparts, and this was not the case with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then it was possible for Japan to think about the whole of government policy making and putting the national interest first in devising foreign policy strategies. Now, what has changed in Japan that created a strong incentive for the government to step up and to think about how to deal with these challenges? Well, I would say that the neighborhood has, of course, become much more dangerous, and there's much that we can talk about in the Q&A about where the region is heading. But for the purpose of leaving enough time for that, let me just be very brief and say that I believe that there is concern in Japan, and I wonder how that plays out in South Korea. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that and others. But I think that strategic thinkers in Japan have been worried about the direction of both great powers, and are worried about a strategic rivalry veering potentially into some kind of conflict. And I think that China, under Xi, certainly, has been essential to Japan's geopolitical awakening. And it's been interesting to see the profound change in Japan-China relations. And there's this term that we use a lot in the United States in thinking about how the US-China relation has evolved, and that is engagement. That's not a popular term in Washington these days. But if there was an ardent practitioner of engagement, I would say that was Japan. Because Japan sought to reestablish relations with China after the destruction of it caused during World War II. And after China came out of that turmoil of the Mao years, with economic engagement as a pillar of rebuilding the Japan-China relation. And when China began to open up and integrate itself into the world economy, a very vast trade and investment relationship was established between Japan and China. Well, that relationship's still there, still critical for the Japanese business sector. But you read now Japan's national security strategy, which was released less than a year ago. And now China is identified explicitly and openly as Japan's biggest security challenge. And there are many things that worry Tokyo about China. One is certainly the non-transparent military buildup. There is also concern about how China is pushing for expansive territorial claims, paying little attention to international law, both in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. But I would say that there's also deep misgiving about China perhaps trying to erode, undermine the traditional role that the United States has played as security anchor to the region, weakening its network of its hub and spoke of alliances, which, of course, for Japan is extremely problematic because the alliance with the United States remains the anchor of its security and foreign policy. But nevertheless, Japan does want to have functional, stable relations with China. And I think getting that balancing act right is indeed one of the key axes of Japanese foreign policy today. Now, when it comes to the relation with the United States, I would say that the last decade actually has seen a deepening of the Japan-US alliance. And it has been the case because of a number of significant defense and security policy reforms in Japan. Japan changed how it interprets the constraints of Article 9 to allow for the collective right of self-defense with important restrictions. Japan also just recently announced that it's going to try to increase its defense expenditure to get closer to a 2% of GDP. Whether they can find the funds to fund it is a different story. But nevertheless, in terms of advertising a different level of ambition, it's there. And Japan's revised its strategic security documents also last year. All those are very welcome developments from the point of view of Washington. And I would say that Washington thinks of Japan as a more valuable ally than in the past because of these changes, and sees in Japan a critical ally in achieving what I think are Washington's priorities. First of all, to remain anchored to the region and to deal with the multifaceted, complex Chinese challenge. And it's interesting to me to see first the Trump administration and now the Biden administration working with Japan on initiatives that Japan had a very much an initiative. It took the power of initiative in launching them, and that is to promote maritime cooperation among the Quad and then expand it to other areas. But also when you think about the power of framing, the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is something that Prime Minister Abe, late Prime Minister Abe, is credited in coining that term, very much now incorporated by the Trump and Biden administrations. Of course, the strategies, when you look at the contents, are not identical, and that's something, again, that it's important to point out. But nevertheless, it doesn't speak of a country in obscurity when you can provide these frames of reference that now guide a lot of the narrative about what the region is, what are the geographical boundaries, and what are some of the sustaining principles for that region. So, and on economic security, Japan also, Japanese companies, even though they've lost some competitiveness, I think that what we've seen recently in the semiconductor industry, and certainly when it comes to economic security, is that many of these companies still occupy critical niches or places in some of the choke points of the supply chain, and that makes Japan a very attractive partner for the United States and other partners of the United States. But having said that, of course, it's been a period of deepening of the U.S.-Japan alliance, but nevertheless, there are gaps and there are differences and there are coordination challenges for the two allies that are very important to look at. First of all, because I feel that there are differences on how they try to address the China challenge. And I think that if I were to describe Tokyo's views on U.S.-China policy, I would describe this as a Goldilocks complaint. They felt that in the early 2010s, certainly during the Obama administration, that the United States was not waking up quickly enough to the challenge of China. And later during the Trump years, they actually felt, oof, we wished for that, and now it's happening too fast, too hot, and perhaps not with sufficient nuance. And they were worried that the United States was veering into defining the competition with China in zero-sum terms. And now with the Biden administration, I think that there is a sense that the Biden administration is bringing more discipline across the board on foreign policy. But nevertheless, there's one element where there's still a huge gap between Japan and the United States, something that Seong-ho already alluded to when he introduced the talk, and that is on foreign economic policy. Because there is the concern, and I think it's shared by many in South Korea, that there's a lot of America first economic policies in the Biden administration, and that's a point of continuity between the Trump years and the Biden years. The policies have been implemented differently, but the motivation behind the policies or the goals of the policies are still very similar. So it's a great source of concern that the United States is not doing more in terms of economic engagement in the region. So, you have these changes, a more social and political stability, then the centralization of power that allows for thinking strategically about foreign policy, and a host of very significant challenges around you that I think explains why Japan was able to do more, had some capability to do more. But I haven't yet answered what I think is the core puzzle that I laid out. How can you do more with less? And here's where I would just very briefly talk about this network strategy, because I think that the insight is based on a connectivity, a grand strategy of connectivity. And I think that the idea is that if you have resource constraints, the best way you can maximize on what you have is by establishing partnerships, by trying to push for regional groupings, and therefore to be doing all these heavy lifting in terms of diplomacy. So, for example, on the economic front, Japan is very much embedded in the Indo-Pacific economy. It started when Japanese companies went out through global supply chains, but also now because of the government push for infrastructure finance. A lot of people, I would refer to that as loud diplomacy, how China has advertised its Belt and Road Initiative. But a lot of people are not aware that when it comes to Southeast Asia, the one country that competes with China and sometimes is ahead of China in terms of infrastructure finance projects is Japan. And that also goes to the quiet leadership, because it goes under the radar, and perhaps it shouldn't. And it's also a call for Japan perhaps to play more role in advertising what it's doing in the region. But also in terms of security diplomacy, I think that it's been interesting to see Japan elevate partnerships with countries other than the United States as a push for security diversification, because clearly, again, I believe this is also felt in South Korea, there is concern about where the United States is going and where there is consistency in U.S. foreign policy or not. So what I found in the book is that Japan has elevated its security cooperation with countries like Australia, India, Vietnam. More recently, you saw it last week in the Philippines. There's a lot going on, and this adds to the network. Now, this, I think, has made Japan far more consequential to the region. And I forgot to mention on the economic front, and this is very important, that Japan sits now at the nexus of the two mega trade agreements in the region, the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP, which quite frankly would have died had Japan not stepped up to rescue it after the United States left, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which South Korea is a member of, which is a 15-member trade grouping with China. And it's a very important trade agreement because it also sends a signal that there's no interest in a zero-sum competition in the region. Now, I would say that then you begin to see a very different Japan, also by pushing for the free and open Indo-Pacific, which to me is a regional strategy of greatest ambition that Tokyo has pushed for, and that has some principles that I think are attractive in terms of how you structure relations among the countries in the region: freedom of navigation, rule of law, freedom from coercion, all these principles that I think are about bringing stability. And for that reason, they're appealing. But it's important because this is not just rhetoric, and there were concrete benefits to cooperation through security cooperation, like providing funds to enhance the maritime surveillance capabilities of Southeast Asian nations. Now, Japan has done a lot, but it faces significant challenges as a network power, because it's not easy to be a network power in a fragmenting world. And because I do want to tease out what this means for the trilateral relationship, let me just give you a hint of what I see as Japan's challenges as a network power, and then I'll move to just briefly some comments on Japan, South Korea, and the US. First of all, Japan handled the public health crisis of the pandemic well, but it turned insular in terms of its border restrictions. And this goes against the logic of connectivity. So that, recovering from that, not just having the tourists back, because they're back in force in Tokyo, but it's about having the students, the researchers, all those people who would make a lifelong investment in the country is a challenge. Japan also faced the challenge of balancing what has been its regional economic integration strategy with CPTPP, RCEP, infrastructure finance, with this new push for economic security, because there is a contradiction there as to whether you promote economic interdependence or you hedge against the risks of economic interdependence. And last but not least, Japan is a network power, but one that still has severe limitation in its use of force abroad. And it's hard to be a power like this in this current Darwinian international environment where we see now open conflict, war in Europe, in the Middle East, and tensions in the Indo-Pacific rising. So those are challenges that Japan faces going forward. If I may, I'm just going to use 5 minutes to talk about this trilateral relationship, because of all this network strategy that I've been describing, there's been a very important and significant gap for Japan, where it was not doing as well, and that is its relation with South Korea. And I think it's important that we're now seemingly in a much better place, and it seems that it might be possible to deepen cooperation. But if you think just a few years back, this was one of the lowest points in the Japan-South Korea relation. If you think about 2018, 2019, when historical frictions were having spillover effects, and they had spillover effect in an export control dispute between Japan and South Korea, when Japan imposed tighter export controls on some chemicals that are shipped to South Korea, delisted South Korea from its white list of preferred partners in export controls. South Korea responded in kind, delisting Japan, and took the case to the WTO. And there were other grievances and other spillover effects in security as well. And this was extremely problematic and concerning because it looked like these disputes, sensitive issues, were now going to have further impact and also influence other areas of the relationship. And now, for the past year and a half, I think that we've begun to see correction course, and we've begun to see an improvement, a rapprochement between Japan and South Korea. And I'll talk about the trilateral, but I want to emphasize that it is Japan-South Korea rapprochement which is the essential piece, because absent that, the United States may encourage, may try to provide incentives, may try to expand the benefits from cooperation, but if Japan and South Korea are not in a good place in the relationship, this will come to nothing. So when President Yoon came into office, he offered a different solution to the forced labor issue that provided an opportunity to move past that stalemate. And I realized that still controversial decision here in South Korea, and there are divided views on that. I think it was better received in Japan, but it provided at least the opportunity to think about how we get past this negative cycle, and can we then promote cooperation. And there's been a lot of repair work. Japan has once again brought South Korea into its white list. South Korea has done the same, and the WTO dispute was set aside. Importantly, I think that economic security is an area where there's a lot of potential for Japan and South Korea, and also with the United States, to accomplish a lot. So let me then talk a little bit about the potential, what could go well, but also, to talk about areas where I think that there's still room for improvement in terms of making sure that the potential of trilateral cooperation on economic security is materialized. First of all, the upsides. Well, you're talking about advanced liberal democracies with very sophisticated technological systems. So I think that there's a lot that can be done in terms of thinking through and disseminating standards for the responsible use of these emerging technologies, AI, for example. There's a lot of potential areas of complementarity in critical industries such as semiconductors, and Samsung just invested in a project in semiconductors in Japan. And it's my understanding that there's going to be a Kishida-Yoon meeting in APEC this week, and that they'll go together to Stanford to announce work together to boost or create a supply chain for ammonia and so forth. And, critical minerals, there are many areas where they can work together. And I think it's therefore positive to see that this potential is beginning to be realized. But I also feel that South Korea and Japan are in the same place in terms of emphasizing de-risking, not decoupling. They also would like the United States to stay true to this notion of an export controls, a small yard with a high fence that is not to be overextensive in technology restrictions, because these are all economies that are deeply integrated with China. And they also would like to see the United States stay true to the spirit of friendshoring and not just me-shoring, which is important given the stakes of these critical industries. But nevertheless, I would say that there are two areas where I would suggest they're tricky and more work needs to be done. And the basic point being that economic security is not going to advance on autopilot. And by this, let me just say one word about export controls. Seong-ho is the expert here, and he kindly participated online at a workshop we had at Brookings on this topic. And then also about the CPTPP, and I'll end with this. On export controls, we're in a new era. The United States has redefined its objectives on technological competition with China. And it has said that because of China's civil-military fusion, China is using readily available technology for commercial purposes towards boosting its advanced weapon programs. And therefore, that the past objective in terms of export controls of staying 1 or 2 generations ahead of China is no longer sufficient. And it's important to stall for as long as possible China's technological deepening in certain areas. This was a speech that the National Security Advisor of the United States gave last September, and by the following October, just a few weeks later, we had a very important change in the export control rule of October 7th, which basically seeks to restrict China's access to advanced chips that are helpful to train AI and for the operation of supercomputers. And, immediately this created a lot of pressure on U.S. allies, because they also have to operate with these restrictions, because some of these rules have a principle of extraterritoriality, and means that they cannot sell those chips to China if they use American technology and components. And the United States immediately began to ask, it had been asking, but now that the export rule went forward, asked its allies to come on board and align its export control policies. Because it's very clear from the point of view of the United States that for its export controls to be meaningful and prevent these chips from being circumvented and reaching China anyway, you need your partners to work with you, to implement the controls, to have visibility into whether there's any loophole, and for greater legitimacy of the policy. And this has not been an easy decision for any U.S. partner, but we think that the Netherlands and Japan did sign an agreement, and they actually revised their export control regulations this spring. South Korea has not had a similar negotiation with the United States, because its semiconductor industry and its exposure to China is very different, because South Korean firms have very large fabs in mainland China. And they actually have been operating with a veil of uncertainty, because after October 7th, the United States has given them temporary licenses to continue to bring some of the equipment they need to operate, but those licenses will not last forever. And that means that these companies have very significant sunk costs in China with a lot of uncertainty as to where this goes next. And what I want to highlight is that the United States would like to bring South Korea into this effort to coordinate export controls, but it's difficult because each partner of the United States has strengths in different elements of this semiconductor supply chain, and because they also may have different risk tolerance to how this may impact the relation with China. And that, I think, remains the next frontier, to be able to have South Korea as part of these, like-minded export control coalition. Secondly, and I end here, it seems to me that Japan and South Korea, having improved their relations, removed one significant obstacle for South Korea to join the comprehensive and progressive TPP. And I'm still puzzled, and I would welcome views as to why this is not happening. From some conversations I've had with South Korean experts when they come to Washington, they explain to me that South Korea has made a decision to emphasize the Indo-Pacific economic framework because it's a founding member of IPEF, because it involves the United States, and that's therefore, and because CPTPP, there would be perhaps some sensitive industries and there would be political backlash. But to me, I worry that Korea is not capitalizing on one of the benefits of having improved relations with Japan, that it's not an either or, you can pursue both. And I worry precisely because IPEF is a very uncertain proposition. We just saw what happened this week. The announcement just came out earlier this week that the United States is suspending the trade pillar of IPEF because of pushback from influential politicians in the United States who are not happy with traditional digital trade rules that the United States has championed in its trade agreements, and because they're not happy with the lack of enforceable labor standards, despite the fact that if the U.S. does not put market access on the table, it's very difficult to expect that others will reciprocate and accept these binding obligations. So to me, I end up here. And I end up here because I think there's a lot of upside in Japan-Korea-US cooperation. It's not going to be easy to implement it. There's sensitive areas, certainly when it comes with economic security, but also it's very important not to lose sight of the opportunity to anchor some of that cooperation and use the window of opportunity. And I would make a strong case for South Korea taking the CPTPP option very seriously. Thank you.
Excellent. It's always wonderful to see how Dr. Solis, can make all those complicated issues so easy to understand and clear, and make all the point right, make a right point. With all this complicated topic and discussion.